Legends say that when the world was young, the god of fertility spat on the earth and created Lake Cerulia. People thought that was gross,
So they changed the spitting part to a teardrop instead. For all we know, it could have been his piss. But whatever came out of the guy, it formed this magical lake. It was so magical that the land became really rich. Doing what man does best, they took the lake for themselves and made ridiculously huge homes, castles, and other stuff. This is how the kingdom of Cerulia came to be. Cerulia's wealth didn't go unnoticed for too long. Soon, trade came from the kingdom of Alkos, an exotic land of unchecked capitalism. It's said that these people were so good with money that they were bad at everything else, even when it comes to protecting their own home. And that brings us to the Gegners! War-hungry barbarians who'll kill anyone that gets in their way. Long story short, they're the bad guys. Everyone hates them, and that's all you need to know. Anyway, that's the world so far. Did you get all that? Well, good for you, you nerd. But all those things don't really matter. Wanna know why? 'Cause you're here for the girls. That's why. And to get them, you've gotta go through something that does matter. My story.
Hello, and welcome to TheBlueShifting. I am, of course, TheBlueShifting. If you are here, and this is like your first time at one of our live streams, welcome. This is what I call a wrap party. Simply, it is the time where I get to talk about no holds bar, everything on the table, review of an entire game. Because there's a tradition on the channel, typically, especially with multi-branching storylines, I typically only show one ending. There are exceptions sometimes, but usually that's the case. And so when that's happening, I take the time to kind of go over the game as a whole afterwards, where I talk about all the routes and all the different mechanics of the game and just kind of give my overall, I guess you could call this the review. Ultimately, this is just my overall wrap-up of it. Now, keep in mind, if you are listening to this, it is very spoilerific. If you haven't played this game, I actually very highly recommend it. Not just because it's you're going to hear spoilers, but this game, flat out, completely blew me away with some of the things and mechanics and the way that the stories actually play out. This is not what it seems, and that's what I'm going to be talking a lot about tonight. But thank you so much, and if you happen to be here live, awesome. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. You can, of course, comment as I go, and I'll kind of read your thoughts, and you can kind of help guide the conversation. But if not, most of you are likely listening to this after I've broadcast it, and then you can just kind of hear my thoughts verbatim. Just keep in mind, again, this is a live thing, so there's no editing here. There's no real adjustments or anything other than me kind of eyeballing the sound quality and my voice, so this is what you get. Now, let's go right into it. So, the title of this live stream is the deepest Eroge ever made. Now, that's more clickbaity than I like, just because I haven't played enough visual novels to be able to quantifiably say that, but for what this game is, and even that intro that played at the beginning that we're going to actually have playing in the background occasionally, because the way that these kind of broadcasts go, I actually just need to realize I should probably set it to do repeating. Okay, well, I guess I don't know where that button is, so I might have to manually do that until I figure out why. Anyway, when I started this game, it kind of really plays itself off as oh, this is just the quirky dating sim where you just have these cute girls and you're just gonna try and kind of get with someone before the end. And it even plays it up in the first few weeks of the game where it's oh yeah, you're gonna be a squire, but we're going to war, and in 4 months you're likely gonna die, so you don't want to die a virgin, so go and find your partner and just do the dance with no pants and all that good stuff. But that's kind of a red herring. This game is actually a lot more impactful than I ever could have imagined, and the mechanics behind it, how it works and how you get the various endings, are frankly in depth. There's a whole system at play that I didn't even know was going on, so the fact that I got the ending that I got is actually really impressive, considering I didn't know any of the mechanics. I learned this later as I was like kind of exploring through the endings, but we'll get to there. We'll get that when we get to that. Ultimately, though, I just want to say that like kudos to the writers and the world builders, because for a game that kind of plays itself off as like just a little dating sim with like cheesy lines and cheesy graphics and cheesy everything, it really comes around and plays the heartstrings powerfully. Like the characters are well thought out. There's a lot of depth to them, even to our protagonist, who comes across as like a stereotypical no-eyed, like risque protagonist character, but he's anything but. He comes across very early on as just kind of like, you'd call him perverted, but I would argue that like it's just kind of how young men are, and I think young women too, but like, he just doesn't have much of a filter, so he says a lot of what's on his mind, or he gets overly distracted very easily. And there's absolutely fan service in this game. Absolutely. Like, some of it subtle, some of it not subtle at all. But when push comes to shove, you find that that's like the weakest points of this type of game and type of story. And it's funny because it kind of tries to sell itself as a game type that typically I just avoid because I don't find it very engaging to play in Eroge. But this game kind of always caught my eye, and I decided to give it a whirl, and I'm really happy I did because it really took my expectations and threw them out the window. So I'd like to go and break down a bit into the story of the main girls cast and just kind of like the subtleties of each path that you go down. And then I'll round it off, of course, with who I thought was best girl overall, since I was able to see all of the game and all of the endings. So, I want to say first off that it's a lot. There's a lot of content in here, and it's really easy to miss it. But thankfully, the New Game Plus system, so when you beat the game once, you can go back through and not have to worry about like buffing your stats, like that part of the management. You can focus purely on like the romancing stuff, so it kind of lets you go through the experience a lot faster, but it's still so easy to miss content that way that you still end up kind of going through it relatively slowly. So it's interesting to be able to see that, but to know that like it's not nearly as long or like kind of slow paced as it was the first playthrough. So I'll start with the one that we saw on the playthrough itself. That was Vel. Vel's ending, Vel's story was fantastic. As you got to see with the story there, the idea of her being this like deceptively strong character kind of played really well into the kind of trope that we see with like Taiga from Toradora. Like I wouldn't necessarily call her like a tsundere. I guess you kind of could qualify her as that, but I don't think she was really like hard to get her to show like her like emotional side. She just didn't get close to people, so she tends to kind of have this rough and tough exterior, but a lot of it had to do with her trying to compensate for her persona as Sir Grand, where she spent half of her life being this highly respected knight who was known as like the grand champion of the entire realm and being pretty much like the poster child for the entire like country. And so when she was not in the armor and was Vel, she still felt like this obligation to be this heroic character. And so her training and probably some supernatural enhancement made her really, really strong, and she was able to utilize that. And so she goes to taverns, she gets in brawls, she goes into drinking contests, has a great like constitution, is able to outdrink most people. So despite her stature, like she outpaces, outdrinks, and outstrengthens pretty much everybody. And it's fun because they take that trope idea and they really flip it on its head, because not only do they have an explanation for why the shrimp-like girl has so much like strength, you also get to see like a lot of that motivation of why. And not only does she have like the it's like the haunted armor that she bonds with that kind of helps her give her power and her ability to work in like the storyline. Like you also see that she's plenty strong on her own, that it's not just the armor, and that Millie as a character has her own arc and storyline all her own. And so like you going down the Vale like route isn't just about Vale, it's about Vale and Millie and what they are together, and also the disturbing things that they are together. And that's really interesting to kind of jump into, because at first the game focuses on a lot of those physicality stuff, like, oh, she's a cute girl, it's like she's on the smaller side, but like she's kind of got that adorableness to her. She's like self-conscious about like the way she looks and how she's perceived. But then you step away from that so quickly and step into this whole world of understanding, like, this is a girl who has got the burden of the world on her shoulders, and she can't tell anyone about it. And she also is like one of the sole survivors of like a horrific massacre where she watched all her family and friends when she was a child like literally slaughtered in front of her. And that impacts still affects her every moment of every day. And that understanding like how that feels and that kind of like post-traumatic stress and that big that all-consuming void that kind of creates inside a person is really something quite interesting to be able to see and break down, because it's like it puts you in a position that I think is very real, that it's hard to explain, which is like, how do you help somebody who's gone through something like that when you don't really have a frame of reference for such an event? And it's like, I like how the focus of it had like an arc of helplessness, which is kind of a theme that you get through the third and fourth months. You kind of get this aura of overwhelming events that make it tough to be able to just deal with or to know what to do. And yet the beautiful thing about the fix was that like the main character didn't have to like say some magic phrase or do some great deed. He just needed to be there. And like the emphasis went early on from like, wow, this girl's really cute, to quickly being like, hey, I like the character's like, I enjoy spending time with Vale. She enjoys spending time with me. Like we're friends. And it emphasized that like there's a friendship there that was built up over time of getting to know each other and starting to be there for each other and trusting each other with secrets. And then they start training together and kind of trying to improve each other in their various strengths and weaknesses. And then when the world kind of starts to comes crashing down around Vale's ears with Millie, both when they became physically connected and kind of became this like avatar of destruction, and when Millie eventually was able to let go of her anger and leave, and having to take Vale, who had become so dependent on this person, this spirit, all of her childhood, and then suddenly getting thrust into a world where she has to kind of just be under her own power. That's terrifying, and it was really hard to almost watch, because as a character you couldn't help but feel like your heart was bleeding for her, because there's just a raw realness to it, despite how fanciful the storyline is. Because like the character sells the pain so well. Like I won't say the voice work in this game is perfect. By far, it's not. You can tell this is like a first publication series. A lot of the voice actors are probably like aspiring voice actors who are working with like whatever equipment they can get their hands on, not really working in studios and not being able to have live direction. The consistency of the voice and audio work is not quite there, but it's pretty good for what it is. And like again, keeping in mind that this is like a first project, a first publication, I still think that the groundwork and the character work and voice work is really well done, considering that. And this is why I like being able to focus on smaller developers on the channel, at least somewhat, because I feel like we need to give voice and platform to these games that people are making that are really good and high quality, but don't have the tenure or the budget that a lot of like these larger companies, typically in Japan, have to make games like this. And I was really impressed with like the overall like the romance and like how the transition of friend to romance was so gradual. And in fact, it felt like it was communicated fairly clearly that Vale had started to kind of catching feelings for the protagonist before the protagonist even knew that he was catching feelings for her, just because of the way their interactions would go. The fact that Vale got jealous of Giselle, which I thought was interesting because they had like specific dialogue for like Giselle, so it means like different characters could have triggered that event, and it likely would have had like at least a slightly different variation on that text. Like again, that just shows a level of quality to like the writing scheme behind scenes that just shows the amount of love that went into this story building here. Because writing scenes that can be that diverse and can adjust so specifically is not easy. Like writing that out is very, very difficult. It's the long and hard road as a writer goes, and so it shows just how much they really cared as making the story for Vale. And then, of course, the ending was the most amazing ending ever. Seeing the characters go, having each other's backs, fighting in the wars, returning home, seeing Vale rebuild Mortimer and kind of lead like the anti-pirate fleet, and then like how the Squire was being trained to kind of be Hugh's replacement as a logistics knight. Like that idea of him having like a role in the kingdom afterwards was really cool to see, and to see that they also shared a future that they genuinely loved together, like where Vale kind of got to grow into herself and to not be tied up in like hiding in this big armor set, but got to just kind of be herself and even embrace that feminine side that she always kind of had but never had time for, but that reminded her heavily of her mom and like the life that she used to have with the dress that Millie made for her, and just everything all together. It was just a wonderful story that I walked away from feeling so much more whole. Like I was genuinely emotionally invested in their story, and when it came to an end, even though the ending was fairly abrupt, but like the logistics of it makes sense. Essentially what happens is that once you hit the 4th month, the game just simply is checking for qualifiers. For each character, there's certain specific scenes that are critical. I think there's about 4 or 5, maybe 6 per character, and these are turning points. They're like scenes that unlock after you get so far along like their relationship bar, and as you hit them, like it kind of progresses their story past certain checkpoints, and eventually once you hit that last scene, like once you hit that last scene and you're in the 4th month, it typically triggers the end game. You could say that it triggers the end scene, the end resolution, gives you the ending you've earned. So the 4th month is kind of your catch-up month, where if you are lacking in certain areas or you have last-minute stuff you want to do, it kind of gives you some wiggle room. But essentially, you can get everything you need to done in the 3 months the game gives you, which is essentially what it did. I think I only got a week into that final month before it triggered the finale and just like kicked us off into it. And that was interesting. It was unexpected. I thought I had more time, and so whilst I was like happy I got the ending I got, it definitely was a bit of a surprise. Now, so that's my thoughts on Vale. Like, her as a character ultimately had so much growth and so much attention to detail for her story that I kind of was floored. And when I jumped into the next set of games and started playing through the other storylines, I kind of was expecting that like maybe I just happened upon like the writer's favorite, because I've seen in some dating games and some kind of branching narratives that there's one storyline in particular that seems to get a lot more attention than the others, and maybe that's supposed to be the canon and the path, or it's just simply a bias that might not be like overtly recognized by the writer. But regardless of that, like sometimes you can kind of feel that. I got the opposite impression of that. I feel like every character had a narrative that felt well adjusted and well focused, and I kind of want to go through each of them. It's going to be a little faster this time because, again, I'm not going to rehash too many of the same points that I've covered with Vale's story, but talk about what makes the other stories a bit different and kind of just go over them in a summary. Again, if you haven't played the game, please, this is a really good time to leave, because this is stuff that I didn't cover on the channel that I'm going to talk about, and it's honestly worth going through because there's some pretty massive reveals, especially in the story I'm going to start with, which is Amy's story. There's some pretty shocking story developments that happened along her path that just absolutely knocked my socks off, and really took it up from what I was like. Hers was the most surprising path, and I'll get to that because from the beginning, and I've said this before, that the trope, even if you're not blood related, of having this we're not blood related, but even though we're adopted siblings or step siblings, and even though we're not technically related, so it's not technically wrong for us to start dating. I've always found that path to be a little it's just not for me. I just find it it can, in a fantasy setting, it's kind of works, in a game, it's it kind of works, but it still touches on emotions and feelings and closeness with direct family members, regardless of blood. that is just a little too for me. It's a trope, some people like it, I'm just not the biggest fan. But Amy as a character is really fun. She's very sweet, very well designed. Getting to know her and her past, she has a lot of these, like, she's very much kind of a superstitious person, where she's got a lot of the typical wifely qualities, where like she cooks, she cleans, she knows how to work on a farm, she knows how to fight for herself and like do the get down and dirty and work on it. But then she's also kind of got a bubbly personality, where it's almost hard to keep her down. She always seems to kind of bounce back from trouble, always seems to have a good answer, is willing to tackle things head on, and she's also very superstitious, where she follows a lot of stories. You find her on her birthday with that that ritual in the pond. You also have these interactions with her where you see that she's very caught up in like myth stories and these tales and wives' tales that she gets caught up in, that she gets overly preoccupied with, but not to the point where it feels like she's crazy, just more to the point where like she just spends a lot of energy on it, which is kind of like, okay, calm down, sis, like it's okay. But you can kind of see that like they do a good job of kind of painting this idea of like how she wasn't quite on the feeling of like this kind of like brother sister turning into a type of romance until she realized the reality of the fact that the main character is about to go to war. It's that forms the catalyst of her understanding, like, wait, I don't want things to change. And that's a sentiment I think we can all understand. Like, I don't think every one of us... I'll talk to Mama. One second. Sorry about that. Anyway, so we have this idea of Amy being this kind of character where she doesn't want to let go of the life she's come to know. She's like her and her dad. She lost her mom when her mom was young, and she doesn't want to lose this brother who's just become an intrinsic part of the family. And that kind of puts this complicated spin on everything, which is really where like the birth of the feelings come from for her. It's nice because it's not like this whole like, oh, I've always buried these feelings for her this whole time. It's more of like the gap between familiar and romantic love is not as broad as you might want or expect. And that's kind of like, again, maybe that's part of why I find it a bit uncomfortable, because like it makes you wonder like how true that could end up being for people. And that's a situation I don't know if I could handle. So we get to see though that like a lot of her superstitions and stuff kind of come to a head when you reveal like her mom being a very healthy, robust woman who like shrugged off issues and always like seemed to come out better for it, suddenly passing away very quickly of an illness, and just like suddenly like one day she's there, the next day she's gone. Well, then you get the twist of a lifetime where you discover through her old belongings that she actually wasn't sick, that she'd been poisoned and murdered. And you find that evidence and you take it to your dad and can confront him with it, and he drops the biggest bombshell in the whole game. Like, it's the biggest twist that I could have ever predicted. One of the things that we talked about specifically in the character development stages of the intelligence branch, because you boost your character in stats like strength, charisma, and intelligence. And at the end of the intelligence one, the character makes an observation I thought was really interesting. He said that like Gegners are supposed to be these really big, brutish, barbarian type people, but if you look at their folklore, their heroes aren't. You'd expect their heroes to reflect this like ideal of a big, gruff barbarian, but instead their heroes are more of these sly, secretive, manipulative people who are able to like work things behind the scenes and be like able to like gain the advantage through guile. And how like he said it's interesting that like the Gegners have this like projection of barbarism, but their idols are almost the opposite. And like, it's an interesting observation. And at the time, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I wonder what that could be applying. Well, it turns out that a lot of that seems to kind of come full circle in Amy's story, because your father's always this big, tall, brutish, like muscle man guy, right? But he reveals that when you kind of call him out for like the death of his wife, he says that it's my fault, because it turns out he's a Gegner. He's a Gegner spy. He was sent from the Gegners to kind of infiltrate and integrate into Cerulia to kind of pass information about like their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses, pretty much setting a stage for potential invasion. Because even though the Gegners were focused on fighting Alkos at the time, like they clearly had their eyes set on Cerulia. Like they were preparing for the next war already, and they'd already sent in agents to do it. And that floored me. I was like, holy crap. But then you like look at the character designs and you look at like the stuff you were seeing reading between the lines, and you're like, oh my gosh, like yeah, all the signs were there, but like you just took a lot of it for granted, because you're like, oh, you got a super big dad whose face you can't see. Like it just seems kind of funny, you know, like maybe he also has no eyes or something. It's like it was almost like in plain sight, and yet it completely caught me off guard. And Amy has to do this whole recollection of this understanding that like it was because her dad tried to back out of his work with the Gegners and focus on just having the family, that ended up having her mom be assassinated by other Gegner agents. And so like, and you find out he's still working with them, like he still passes them information, because he kind of got whipped into shape because they took away his wife, and they were threatening Amy, like implying that like if he didn't toe the line that she'd be next. And like that is a horrific situation, and it's like, how does Amy deal with that? Because she loved her mom, and to find out that not only was her like mom not sick and died but murdered, but her dad was a big part of why, and realizing like, oh, like I'm part Gegner, like this group of people that are like threatening all of us and could be killing my brother, and I'm like technically estranged from that culture, like it's part of my history. And like kind of coming to terms with that, like what does it mean when you have associations like that? Like, can you escape your past, or does your past haunt you? Can you escape? And if you can, like how do you do that? Because like, what is your dad supposed to do? Like, can he just keep doing what he's doing? Can he still be an agent for the Gegners, because he knows that like if he turns away from them that it puts his family at risk? But like, he also has fallen in love with the people of Cerulia, and he doesn't want to betray them. So it puts him in a tough spot, because like he assumed he was so far away from the Gegners that like if he just kind of cut ties, that they would just leave and wouldn't be involved. But then he found very quickly that no, that's not the case. There are other agents that are actually fairly close by. And he even implied sleeper agents, which is crazy. How do you have sleeper agents amongst like a population like that? Like that's crazy to me. So it almost kind of pulls off this whole like Cold War-esque type of like conspiracy, and like trying to deal with that. And the worst thing is that like the main character, he kind of feels really out of place, because he was adopted by this family, and like he didn't even know like the mom, and he's also not related to them at all. So he's like, this isn't even an issue I have much say in, besides the fact that I care about these people deeply and I want what's best for him. But like, what's he supposed to do? Is he supposed to turn in his stepfather? Like say, oh yeah, we have a Gegner spy here? Like, it really brought up a lot of interesting problems. And again, it kind of stepped away from this, like, it almost pulled completely away from this idea of like, oh, do you love your sister romantically? It's like, that was hardly even on my radar at that point. It was like, how do I keep this family from falling apart? But then you can pursue that relationship as you help Amy through. You can kind of see that there is more tying you together than just like having grown up as children together, because there is a stark difference between you two, and that there's a lot to be explored there. And it's a really interesting story to see the ending of. Then I want to kind of go to Giselle, because she was the one who ended up being like the character I spent the most time with. It was kind of happenstance because I just ended up having more social like access to her when I wasn't focused on like when I couldn't talk to Vale anymore. I ended up talking to Giselle a lot just because she ended up being available. And she was interesting because I have to say, from the first get-go, she was the one I actually felt the least connected to. She's super standoffish. I think the description that you go for a character like that was like a kudere, you know, very like cold and emotionless. And that's really tough, like as a trope even. Like it's a tough one for me to get super behind. Just because like it can be really cute, but at the same time it's like unapproachable. Like it's hard to like know how like you would have fun with somebody like that, especially at first. But as you break down the barriers slowly, it feels like it takes forever. Like her the circle that tracks the like how much connection you have with a character doesn't feel like it reflects as easily of the bond you have with her, because she just doesn't express those emotions for a while. So you end up feeling like you get like halfway through her story and you don't feel like you have much of an emotional connection. But it turns out that despite the fact that her character and her background and her interests are often very unaligned with the main characters, there is a lot that does tie her similarity to him, because the one thing they share is they both were children who lived in a town that was destroyed by bandits. The main character was in a town that got destroyed by bandits. He wandered through the forest, half starved, and happened to be found by Hugh, who took him to Cerulia. Now, there's a similar, like the story for Giselle is super similar, because her story is she was in a town, it was overrun by bandits, she was one of the survivors that was captured, but instead of like, she was captured and enslaved, and she was forced to make essentially drugs for the bandits. She was trained there was a knight surgeon, so someone who was trained to fight as a knight, but who also was essentially a field doctor, who they strong-armed through torture into making a drug called Drowser. And they forced him to grab Giselle, who had been trained in basic healing arts from her mom, and forced her to learn how to make it as well. This idea of like insurance and having a person who could make this dangerous and lucrative drug for them. And unfortunately, through the process of like the torture and like the terrible situation they were in, the knight that helped Giselle became addicted to the drowser drug itself, which like essentially it's like the meth of this world. It's just nasty. And so when they got away, and Giselle and the knight were able to wander their way to Cerulia and find kind of like a place to live, he ended up being essentially in rehab until he just eventually dies. And so you see Giselle, who like she's so standoffish, but she's focusing almost all of her attention, besides like her direct work in the hospital, she focuses all her energy on trying to find a cure for these drowser addicts, specifically because she wants to help the man who saved her when her family was killed. But then she fails, and so she has an entire crisis of like, what am I supposed to do if I can't even do like what I set out to do? Like she's like, my whole life revolved around solving and helping these people get over this like terrible disease that I helped inflict, because I helped make the drug that's ruined these people's lives. And she feels like a failure when he dies, because she still feels no closer to an actual cure. And so you have to try and help her really understand like her place and like whether or not it's worth continuing to pursue her interests. And it's just so powerful and intense and just raw. And it even implies that like she might be considering like turning to the drug herself because she doesn't know what else to do. And I think that's the bad end for her. I didn't explore the bad ends. I was too emotionally invested in the characters. I didn't want to figure out what the bad endings were enough. I might still pursue it in my own time eventually, but I doubt it, just because I love all the characters in one way or another, and I don't want to see the bad ends because it implies some pretty dark bad ends. But regardless of that, Giselle's story is so interesting, and it's interesting too because Giselle turned out to be the story I've completed after the main one first, just because I had already gone most of the way in her plot. There wasn't much else to unlock. But that was the first time I unlocked a friendship ending, where I thought I'd done everything right, and I got to the end of the game, and it had a finale, and it was great. It was me and Giselle, and it went through the storyline, but then at the end, we were just close friends who kept in contact with each other and supported each other, and like spent time together, because like her big thing is like she loves board games and like is nerdy, and so like that was definitely a bonding point for me. It's just like, okay, yeah, like this is a person who's like me like in real life, and I was like, yeah, like she's pretty fun in that regard. And so I got into this whole idea, like, but I saw that there's a friendship ending. It's like it didn't have a romance. It just was like we were there for each other and support each other long after we got back. Like we were always like kind of supporting each other. And like that was really interesting for me, because I walked away from that and I was like, like why did I get the friendship ending with Giselle, but I got the romance ending with Vel? And I learned by checking the back end and looking at some guides, I kind of figured out how the system works. So the system checks for a few basic things, but namely, remember I mentioned earlier, there are checkpoints that happen during the storyline. They are like they're key scenes, you could say. These are the scenes that like trigger growth in like the heart, like going up a stage, or they're just like midpoints where like major story arcs are like moving forward. And in those storylines, you typically have like an emotional encounter, and you have responses you can give, one of two. Turns out these are gates. There are gate checkpoints, and I believe the game, like the guide said that there are 4 of them. There are like 6 of these encounters. There's like the first one, and then there's the last one. The last one, the one you get, dictates kind of like the feel that you're going to have for that ending. But the 4 leading up to it are the ones that are like impactful. And for each one, there's a yes or there's a right and wrong answer, essentially. I feel like if you understand the character and you're really invested in the storyline, guessing the right ones isn't too difficult. But I missed it with Giselle. I'm not sure when, but I did. And from the guide, what it said, granted, again, these are speculations. I didn't have time to thoroughly like figure it all out absolutely on my own, but the guide seemed pretty on the point, and a lot of people are supporting of it. So I'm going to go ahead and report what it said. It was on Steam. It's fantastic, by the way. But the idea is that the type of ending is determined by how many of these gated question points, these like events you trigger in the most positive way or not. It determines like whether you become friends or if they become romantically interested in you. So essentially, if you go through all the storylines and you get like 0 of them on the right side, you get the bad ending. Like essentially, I think it's a guarantee that you die and that they have something awful happen to them post-war. If you get like 1 to 3, I think, of them, you get the friendship ending, which is that typically, like, as long as your stats are good, you make it to the end, you survive the end, and they will survive, and they kind of make progress in their lives, and you become lifelong friends. But that's the thing, it's like that kind of stays that way. It's if you get to like 4, or at least 3 and 4, there was some debate on whether you had to get all 4 of them or not proper. Then you got the romantic ending, this ending where like you fell for each other. And that's why I said it was so amazing that like my one playthrough, one time blindly going through the game, the fact that not only did I end up on the path with Vel, because at first I didn't think that was the ending I was going to go for, but it ended up changing to that, but that I got the romantic ending is actually pretty impressive. Like, it kind of says a lot about, I think, her story and how it spoke to me, that I was, by answering the questions honestly, like the way I felt was the best, was the answer that led to her like best ending. And I'm really proud of that, actually, because like again, I think it kind of points out that like I had a good feel for like the writing and style and character, which was great. And Giselle's too. Like obviously I got the friendship ending, but like I just didn't nail it all the way. And that's the thing, is like my first playthrough for all the other characters, I ended up getting the friend endings. So if I want to go back and get the romantic endings for all the rest of them, I have to like essentially go back, play them through all over again from the beginning, and make sure I get those checkboxes perfect. But it's just so interesting to me that like I managed to do that on my blind playthrough. I'm very happy I got to do that. So anyway, that's the Giselle arc and the Amy arc kind of side by side, and kind of like that how the back end works. I think is really good to see that distinction between the two. Now we're going to move to the princesses, Kamala and Beatrice. I'll probably start with Kamala. Kamala's was really interesting because you get to see this like idea of a cultural reference, cultural differences, and kind of seeing like how different values translate. And it was clear, like from the way it was written, at first it felt very tropey and almost like is pseudo racism a thing? Like this idea that like it was kind of playing off of racist like tropes in like the game world, kind of like what happens in the real world. But at the same time, it really stepped away from that and stepped into this idea of like how, as a representative of Alkos and a woman who wants to be independent and coming from a culture that was very male dominated, she was determined to try and make a positive difference in the world and trying to make a progressive stance to try and make sure this alliance went together to save her people as best as possible, to build friendships, and to kind of take this chance to stand out from amongst her siblings, because she had a lot of siblings, and despite being the oldest of the family, she was never really given a whole lot of care or attention because she wasn't a primary heir. And just kind of seeing that idea, and then also kind of mixing this whole idea of like a different culture's viewpoints and kind of introducing each other to like the words that were made up, obviously, but very much based on real cultures and like real interactions that happen in the world. And throwing this in together, it was really fascinating to see. And like I said, I think it was done very tastefully. Like most of these plot lines, at first it kind of comes off very like rough and very like tropey, but it quickly diverts and spends the majority of its time in this world of like of pain and like growth and personality, where you see her struggling not only with like the direct and fiery opposition that some people, especially people who survived or had relatives in Mortimer, how they resist like being friends with people whom they believe are responsible for or were negligently responsible for the destruction of that city, and like kind of are placing that blame onto her, and that effect that has on her, where she just like, she came here and she's like, these are our potential allies, they're our friends, I want to get to know them, want them to get to know me, and together we'll build a better future. And to have people who blatantly go into her face and say like, look, we don't like you, we want you to go away, and like trying to deal with that, because I think all of us can understand that like that would be a very difficult thing to face, especially when you're like far from home, pretty much by yourself, you're like immersing yourself in a culture. It'd be like trying to move to another country and like having them openly like hate you and even like whip up mobs and attempt to like attack you and your allies. Like there's some pretty scary instances that happen in there, and like the covering the idea too of like the perspective of like trying to be a peacekeeper, essentially like a police officer. Like you're just trying to do what's right, but like how do you like turn aside your people? Like, do you raise weapons against your own people, even though they're definitely in the wrong? Like, but it feels wrong to do that because they're your people. They're like part of your nation, and they are highly motivated, but their motivation is based on like wanting to protect their friends and family. It's like you can't really find fault in that, and it really brings up that kind of tough zone that's really there. And it's funny because like Kamala's story and Vel's story are very parallel, which is apparent because they end up being involved in each other's story in small ways, but like in notable ways. Which is really fun to see because you kind of see both sides if you play, but like each as you play through each character's like developing lines, and it's really fun to see that there was so much attention to detail between those two, where you actually kind of see essentially two different versions of the same events happening on Vale's side and on Kamala's side, where you have like a protest. And then there's like the violent protest, and like they're both events that happened in both their storylines, but from different angles and perspectives. Where Val is like being criticized for not being a part of the uprising because she was with Mortimer, and how she had trouble because she definitely agreed with what they were saying, but also felt like it was wrong, and trying to like deal with that combination. And Kamala is an outsider who's feeling like she's failing at the very basics, which is just like being friends. She's like, oh, I'll just go there, I'll talk to people, I'll help them understand who we are, it'll be great. And she's like, comes away from that feeling like, oh my gosh, like I'm completely out of my depth. And then she also has pressure to like collect information and to send it off, and like it puts her in a position where like even if it was like relatively harmless information, but if it gets like if she gets caught out and like is blamed for being a spy, like it not only could ruin the alliance, but it could lead to her like literal death. And it's like as your character finds into these signs and isn't sure what to do, like it kind of, you got to play off of like, do you trust your friend, this person who you've grown close to, or do you trust the circumstantial evidence, which just seems to point that she's doing things that she's not supposed to. And it really, I definitely know why I got my friendship path with her, because I was trying to pick the right path, but like based on her reaction, I absolutely did not pick the right path. And so that was just awful, and I felt terrible for it. Got her friendship ending, thankfully, but yeah, that's a tough one. Kamala as a person is very interesting. And she and Beatrice open up this really interesting dialogue. It was hinted at the end of the Veil's like story that Kamala and Beatrice have a connection that's emotional and intimate, and it kind of highlights that for her, because like in Alcos she talks about how like they view sex and sexuality as very something that's not to be shy about, but it's very healthy and something to explore. And so for her, like while she is like interested in getting married and having a traditional marriage, she has no qualms about having intimacy with anybody. So seeing that is really interesting, and the way that they kind of communicate it, you almost feel like you can see the growth of those two as you like follow her or Beatrice's storyline. You can see that they have a closeness that they start building toward, and how it kind of starts to lend itself in that direction over time, and in a way that just feels really natural, and which is interesting, because like sometimes it feels like you get relationships like that and they feel very like forced, almost like they're trying to be like, oh look, we're inclusive too. And it's like, I understand being inclusive of people with different attractions and motivations, you know, LGBTQ plus and like all of that. Like I think it's important that we don't shy away from or try to like not acknowledge that that's a very much part of reality and that it's okay. But sometimes it feels like it's forced, where it's like they're trying to check a box. Kamala, in a sense, reminded me very heavily of how in the Fata Morgana, a specific character in there who's part of the LGBTQ community was handled, in a sense where it's like it was part of the story and it was organic. It felt like it was a part of who they were, and it was something that didn't come out of the blue. It didn't feel forced. It felt very natural. It was really interesting to see that play out, and to see how you can see the budding relationship between Beatrice and Kamala starting very early in their social link, even as you are drawing closer to them. Like you can also see that they're bonding. So I definitely am interested to see if you get the romantic ending for one of them, like does that become like an actual like relationship, or do they set this aside like there's these other interests and focus on you? That's one of the ones that I almost kind of, out of just the sake of curiosity for the writing, I want to get the romantic ending for. I just didn't have time to before I did this like review, so I'm definitely going to be going back and I want to see at least that much, especially on the Beatrice route, because Beatrice's story is interesting. She impressed me. Her character design immediately impacted me, and initially I was like, I want the Beatrice route. Oddly enough, because of that like lost save I had where I had to redo stuff, completely derailed me and like threw me onto the Veil track and really caught my attention with Vel, and I just kind of went off that way. But as I went down the Beatrice route later, I found that I wasn't wrong. I definitely felt very strongly that Beatrice's route is very fun to explore. She has this really fun persona where she like projects like effectiveness and power and majesty and competence, and you come to know that a lot of that is posturing, not in the sense that it's not accurate. It absolutely is accurate. She is a dominating, forceful, direct leader. Like it's who she is. But that a lot of her motivation comes from like the teachings of her father and and learning about leadership and wanting to be a good leader. understanding that, like, especially where traditionally it has been a male inheritance system, it's not like against the rules for a female to inherit, but it's more difficult. Very similar to some of the lineage issues that were faced in medieval and Renaissance era Europe, where women could take the seat of the throne, but usually it was a last resort, and they often had troubles holding on to power. And so she's like aware of that. And so as you go down her journey, you see that, like, as you kind of get to know her, and she starts to rely on the main character, the protagonist, because he ends up being a kind of confidant where she starts to be able to express her true feelings. And even when she's talking to him at first, she typically takes up this normal approach of being like, oh, well, of course I'm like this because I'm perfect, and like this is the right answer. This is the answer that should be expected. But then as you continue to talk to her, you kind of break her down. You start to see like, oh, no, she's just a person. She projects this feeling of like superiority, but a lot of it is about posturing, and that she really has a very normal... It sounds funny because like it's something you're like, well, duh, of course she is. But like the way that the writers communicate it, it's like her domineering and forceful presence feels very much like her. But then as you get to know the real her at the same time, that also feels very much like her. It doesn't feel like a contradiction, which is often the case with a character like this, where like you start to feel like, oh, they're just a fake. Like even at the beginning, sometimes you'd be like, oh, this character is just full of beans, you know, like they're obviously projecting an image. But Beatrice doesn't feel like she projects an image. Like she does, but like you'd still believe that image. Maybe not 100%, but like 90%. And then you learn about who she is behind the scenes, but that doesn't invalidate that 90% you still believe in. And that's because you get to understand why she feels like she has to act that way, why she faces like posturing and politicking and people who are always like digging for weaknesses and trying to discredit her at every opportunity they can, where every action she makes, whether in passing or in the open, is scrutinized, used, and manipulated in the eyes of others to try and like gain political favor or to tear down her reputation. And so every action she has to make has to be calculated, because if it isn't, it's going to undermine everything. And sadly, being a normal human is not a good way to keep your defenses up, because being a normal human requires you to have vulnerabilities and to feel emotions, and those are things that people can use to try and discredit you. It's actually a problem that you see a lot for women in the workforce, which is this idea that like for some reason if a woman expresses emotion, it comes like people attribute it to being hysterical and like being like overly like over the top. Whereas if a guy expresses emotion, it can still be seen as weakness, but at the same time, it's not criticized nearly as heavily, which is something I see that my wife actually faces. Like that's a real thing that real people face, and it sucks. And like so, Beatrice having to see that is really well reflected. And then as you get to know her and peel back that like the truth of it, you get to have these really precious moments, like how because what happens for her storyline is that her father, who's like very sick, like he actually passes in the story and she becomes the queen. And there's a opportunity, I think it's like, yeah, it's her birthday event where you go to the palace and she's having a party and there's all these like stiff robes and like, you know, politics and people, and they're all like talking to her and they're like, oh, my condolences, but like I can help you with this, and like, oh, I believe we should be like this, and like I can totally help you with the finances of the kingdom, like just let me know, you know, like they come to wish her happy birthday and to give condolences for her father, but like they're clearly there just to pursue their own interests. And it's like she notices it, so she excuses herself and you like follow her. And she goes out into the hallway and she kind of talks about how like it sucks because like a birthday doesn't feel like a birthday, because like the whole time it just feels like she's having to fend off all these people who are just trying to like manipulate her, not celebrate her. And she also talks about how like it's been so hard, and she has like a harsh reflection where she's like, my father just passed away and I've never had a chance to really like be real about that, because nobody wants to see that. People want to manipulate me for that. They don't want to know that I'm just having a hard time sometimes. And she actually starts to cry. And she talks about how like her dad impressed upon her that because like of her position, her status, but also her gender, like he told her like it's important that you never let people see you cry because they'll think that you're weak. But then she's taking that opportunity to cry in front of you, and you're kind of able to just be there for her and kind of help her process this really, really tough emotions where like she's been forced to kind of just internalize the fear of being a leader, of making mistakes, of being criticized and facing like riots, open riots that threaten not only like her friend but even her, and having to deal with the grief of losing a parent whom she loved but never being able to express it because she's always being watched and always has eyes on her and always has somebody kind of like judging her every move and every motion and every blink. And just like that reality that just sucks. It just kind of also highlighted to like, I don't like politicians, but man, I imagine politicians have to go through that. Like, it's not nearly as bad, I think, because a king, a queen, like the only way you get removed from that position is typically you get killed and usurped. Politicians at least can retire, but like at the same time, it's like there's got to be a severe burnout for that kind of stuff, you know? And it sucks when people are nitpicking every little thing you say and do and finding as much weakness as they can. And like, even if you don't pay attention to like the griefers, like it's still gonna get to you. It happens on the internet all the time, right? Like, sure, it's okay and it's healthy to brush it off, but like there's still a part of you that it kind of gets to at times, and that sucks. So Beatrice's path was very moving, and like as she like kind of pulls back the facade a bit and lets you see her as a person, she is one of the more, I think, in-depth and engaging characters. Because it takes so much effort to get to that real person. But once you get to that, she's just a very sweet, down-to-earth person who genuinely cares and has an affection and a love for the people of Cerulia and just wants what's best for them, and has so little that she can take joy in that she becomes a little obsessive over that which she does take joy in, whether it be cream puffs or your presence as a squire, because you become somebody she trusts, and Kamala is someone that she trusts. Again, I really want to get to the romantic ending on that path because I want to know like if there's like any issues that come up with the fact that she definitely starts building feelings for Kamala, but she also is very clearly having feelings for the squire, the protagonist. So I want to go see that ending in detail and just see if there's like anything specific that happens in it. Also, just because the complication of her being like the princess of Cerulia, like literally the queen and ruler, like can she see what that happy ending is? So I'm gonna have to do that on my own time. So yeah, that's all the girls. And oh, hang on. All right, so it disconnected for a second, so I'm gonna kind of rehash what I was saying before. All I was saying was that like all the girls were very impressive and impactful, that there was something to be enjoyed about each and every one of them. And I feel like they all were well written, and I also feel like they were written by a team of writers, because none of them really speaks the same. Sometimes when you read a story or even a visual novel, like you can kind of tell that it was written by one person because like the way characters speak, whilst like they have different voices, like the way that they like structure their sentences can often feel very samey, which is fine. But you can also feel like a strong difference between the characters and the way that they're written. Now that can just be a skilled writer, obviously, but it also could mean that there were multiple writers working together. And I think that that visual novels really benefit from that type of structure. So I'm getting pretty tired. I'm trying to wrap this up. So I gotta say, finally, the end of this absolutely like powerful, wonderful, surprisingly deep and motivating and just captivating dating visual novel sim. It starts off looking like a stupid eroge and ends as one of the more impassionate and well-written stories I've come across. Who is Best Girl? Who's, in my opinion, captured my heart and soul and my interest as a character and as like just a setting and a story in general. It might not be that surprising, but it really was and still is Vel. like, I thought she was best girl pretty early on, and having seen all the other storylines, while I definitely think each girl had their merits and definitely were very sweet and had amazing stories, Vel still takes the crown. And it's funny because, like, when it came to, like, physical appearance and, like the way that they were drawn and depicted, I would order it being closer to, like, Beatrix, Amy, then Vel, and then Giselle, and then probably Kamala at the bottom. But the order of, like, characters whose stories made the most impact on me and got me most emotionally invested, the order would be closer to Vel, Beatrice, Giselle, Amy, and then Kamala. I don't know why, but for me, Kamala's story, while she's definitely a sweetheart and was definitely a lot, like, I don't like putting her on the bottom of both those lists, because, like, you got to keep in mind these lists are, like, if they were, like, on an A to like an S to, like, E tier, like, Kamala is still, like, in the B category. She's still a fantastically well written character, but I just like her character design, I feel like, is a little too focused on her assets and it really, like, a lot of her scenes try to, like, focus on that a lot, like, to the point of like where it got, like, a little tedious. And then her storyline is also one that, like, while engaging and interesting, it also, like, when it came to the big twists, were not as relatable or as emotionally like divisive for me. I don't know if that's just a me thing or what, but compared to, like, the twists that we saw with Vel, Amy, and Beatrice, like, I just feel like they couldn't compare. And so, like, I also just wasn't as emotionally invested in her as I was the other girls. And so, whilst she's a great character, I still just, like, I couldn't put her at the top of either of the lists. But yeah, it's like, when it comes to overall feel and character, Vel is my favorite, and I'm really happy that not only did I get her ending in my first playthrough, but I got the romantic ending. That really made my day, and I'm very happy about that. I think it was very, very fitting, and I'm very excited about that. But yeah, so we're pretty much at the end here. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for joining me on the channel and for being a part of this series. Whether you were watching live or whether you were watching this in post, I highly recommend you play the game. Support the developers, Yang Mobile. They're a smaller developer, so it's always good to put eyes on their stuff, just because it can be hard for new developers, especially who aren't Japan-based, to get, like, eyes on their products as easily. This is easily worthwhile and very much a worthy title. So highly recommend you continue to check out their works. Thank you to them, because they actually contacted me back when this was coming out in its, like, alpha form, where it was just, like, the first chapter part of their Kickstarter. They asked me to cover it, and I did, like, a featurette of it once, and I was impressed. And it's funny because, like, as for that featurette, like, it still was pretty interesting to me, but it was the weakest part of the story that I ended up getting to see. The story got so much better beyond that first taste, and so I almost feel like it kind of does a disservice, because they play into that, like, the tropey, like, Eroge feel to kind of catch people in at first, which for me is kind of has the opposite effect. But it was, like, the investment that came later on that really sunk it in for me. Just so well done. Oh, I guess I'll say the other thing too, like, the gameplay about, like, slaying the monsters and getting the Ocarina of Love and everything. Just kind of fine with that. And Hugh's an interesting character, but he's so minor, like, it barely impacted the story, really, like, in a meaningful way. I thought the gameplay for the forest was pretty engaging, but it also was pretty straightforward. It was pretty clear that, like, all you really need to do is keep your stats, like, going up routinely, and, like, you got, well, like, I even had, like, I think my stats were, like, at, like, 899, and I was able to beat the final level. I didn't even need max stats to be able to beat the end. But then again, I also feel like I went into it with a decent strategy and system that maybe not everyone would have, and so if you're struggling with that, obviously, just work on your stats. But ultimately, it was really, really fun, and I'm really happy to have had it a part of my channel. But all is well that ends well, and it leads us to what's the next series. Now, my Friday series, like this one, I tend to focus on smaller developers, but it's also my Fan Friday Spotlight. It's the idea that, like, patrons of the channel, people who are directly supporting the channel as a whole, get a say in. So whilst I ultimately have final say on everything that happens on the channel, I make sure that they get some very positive say in the voting for the Friday series. especially because like I'm going into these blind and they're going into them blind. Usually they don't know much about them either, and so it gives us all kind of like a chance to just kind of pick the one that we found most engaging. So we had a vote, and the vote ended with 3 different titles, and the vote ended in a 2-way tie, and so it's left to me to be the tiebreaker. And after some consideration and thinking, I've made my choice, and regardless, I know this is going to be a massive pivot in tone. So it'll be really interesting to see how this goes, but besides the fact that Bub Love has some horror elements to it, it's been a while since we've done something that had more of a horror theme, so I think it's about time we jump back into that. So I'm going to end this stream by showing off the trailer of the winner, and the fun thing about it is it's you might recognize the publisher, because we've been talking about them for this video. So without further ado, I'm going to switch over and let that play, and yeah, it'll be kind of my formal announcement. But regardless of that, I appreciate you spending your time here with me. I appreciate you being a part of the channel and enjoying this journey with me. I had a lot of fun with this series, and I'm looking forward to starting a new one, but I'm also sad to see this one go. So I hope you guys will stick around and enjoy future series with me, because, you know, I'm doing 5 videos a week, baby. Real fun to be able to do. Just if you didn't know, at least currently while I'm doing this, I'm doing a rewrite. I'm doing going through Muv-Luv Total Eclipse. I also started doing not visual novel content that I also do on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I've been playing Yakuza 0 and Trails in the Sky, Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky. And they've both been fantastic. So if any of that sounds of interest to you, please check out playlists, go check out my other videos, and just go and jump onto those if you haven't, or if you've like just curious to see what my experience has been with them. It'd be really a lot of fun. But regardless of that, thank you so much. And until next video, watching me, up see me next. I'll see you there.
What's wrong, child? There now. Please don't cry. Oh, I know. Why don't I tell you a story? Stories always make everything better. Once upon a time, there was a lost little girl who wandered around a dark and dreary forest. But then, in the clearing, she saw it. A beautiful place. A holy place. The air was warm and inviting, with a garden full of fresh flowers she could pick and smell. And day and night, the halls were filled with such glorious songs, as if it were home to a choir of angels. Do not be afraid, child, for you have found favor with the Lord. And there the little girl saw her, Mother Idalora, saint among saints.
Hello.
Welcome to heaven on earth.
Huh?
However, it is a place reserved only for saints. And sadly, you are no saint. You are a sinner. But that's all right. Anyone can be a saint, really. You just need the courage to endure a little bit of suffering. Tell me, child, are you up for the task? Yes, just what I like to hear. And don't you worry. Once we're done, you will stand tall and proud with the rest of them. Pure. Perfect.